Geschätzte Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you a very warm welcome here at the National Defense Academy. As Commandant of the Academy, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you here in the Sala Terrena for the 4th Vienna Strategy Conference.
Eines ist ja, glaube ich, bereits jetzt garantiert.
I think one thing is sure. The weather forecast, that is, it's going to be a very hot week, and I'm quite sure that the discussions, the debates we're going to have are going to be heated as well. But I think we would have managed that even if the weather wouldn't have been quite as nice. Now, for this time, we have decided to start with 2 parallel conferences. So right after the introductory speeches, we will start with the cultural and scientific dialogue, which today, this afternoon and tomorrow, up until lunchtime, we'll talk about scientific perspectives of strategic thinking.
Intentionality and strategic decision making. Und hier haben wir Strategie neu.
And in this room, we're going to talk about the topic rethinking strategy. Today's subject will be strategy and will. Ladies and gentlemen, to start, I would like to briefly touch upon 3 issues. First of all, I'd like to point out a few main aspects of the Austrian National Defense Academy, its main role, and why actually it is organizing a conference such as this one, actually a series of conferences. And then secondly, I would also like to give a brief summary. I know that you have received a series of invitations and other documents, but still I would like to briefly repeat in the second part of my speech what the objectives of this Vienna Strategy Conference in general are. So what is the general objective of this series of conferences? And then thirdly, I would also like to talk about this year's specific objectives. Ladies and gentlemen, the Austrian National Defense Academy, first point, is a teaching institution, the highest teaching and training institution for the Austrian Armed Forces. In addition, however, we are also a security think tank which provides manifold forms of support for the armed forces, but also for our military and beyond for other institutions. Due to the expertise which our students have gained while studying at the academy, we are also an advisor to the highest political and military leadership persons. Let me also point out, however, that in addition, we are also the highest research institution in the area of smart sciences in the Austrian armed forces
Ich
structure.
möchte ganz besonders hinweisen, dass wir darüber
And I would
hinaus
especially like
einen
to
gesamtstaatlichen
point
Auftrag
out that we also
wahrzunehmen
have
haben
a
und
national
eine
task, as it
immer
were,
wichtiger werdende und bedeutender werdende
which is
internationale Rolle
also
einnehmen.
increasing as regards the international role
Betreffend
we
den
assume here.
gesamtstaatlichen Aufgaben
As regards our
verweise ich nur
national
darauf, dass
tasks,
diese Institution, die
let me just
Landesverteidigungsakademie,
tell you
eine
that this
ganz
institution, the
wesentliche
National
war und einen
Defense
ganz
Academy,
wesentlichen Beitrag
has
geleistet hat
played a
zur
fundamental role
Konzeptionserstellung
in
der
the
umfassenden
development
Landesverteidigung.
of the
Das hat
comprehensive
bereits in den 60er und 70er
national
Jahren
defense
begonnen, und dieser
strategy.
comprehensive approach, dieser
This comprehensive
umfassende Ansatz,
approach, which
sehen
started in the
spätestens
1960s and
seit
70s,
9/11,
can
seit
actually
dem
be
Jahr 2001 hat eine
seen
immer wichtigere
since
Bedeutung auch
2001,
heute und in Zukunft.
since 9/11, as
Und
regards its increasing
zurückkommend
importance.
auf unsere Rolle als
Now let me come back to our role as a
Forschungseinrichtung.
research
Die
institution.
Landesverteidigungsakademie ist die Trägerin
The National
der
Defense Academy
Militärwissenschaft, die Trägerin der
is in charge of
Militärwissenschaften.
military
Und so
sciences.
sind wir verantwortlich für
As an
den
institution,
Wissenserwerb,
we are in
Wissens-
charge of
Entwicklung und die Wissensweiterentwicklung
developing,
in den Fachbereichen der Militärwissenschaft.
collecting,
So
and
in Strategie,
extending
Militärstrategie,
knowledge in the
Operation,
military sphere,
Taktik,
military strategy, operational
Logistik,
aspects,
Führung,
tactics, logistics, leadership,
Polymologie und
polymology,
anzusprechen und natürlich
to name
darüber
but a
hinaus
few.
auch in
And
den
in
Bereichen
addition,
der
of course,
Militärwissenschaften,
we are
wie
also working in the area of
Sicherheitspolitik,
military sciences, such as security
Militärgeschichte,
policy or
Militärethik
politics,
und anderes mehr.
military history, military
Und
ethics,
gerade
and so
auch
on.
den gesamtstaatlichen Aspekt ansprechend,
And as regards the national
die
role we
letzte
have,
Woche
let
hier
me add
stattgefunden und die Wochen davor,
that only last week and the weeks before that, we
wo
organized
Vertreter der
a
Wirtschaft,
planning
der Industriellen Vereinigung,
exercise
der
with
Wirtschaftskammer
the
Österreich,
representatives of
Vertreter aus
the
Firmen
industry, the
teilgenommen
economy,
haben,
the
aus
economic
Ministerien
chamber,
bis hin zu
from
Vertretern aus
companies, ministries,
Nichtregierungsorganisationen.
and
Und hier
including
ging es
representatives of non-governmental organizations. And this exercise was about
strategisches Denken in
strategic
komplexem
thinking in complex environments.
oder eine internationale
And then
Fachtagung
let me also
ansprechen,
give you
wo
the example of an international
eine
event where a
stattgefunden
tabletop
hat,
exercise was
ein
organized,
Wargaming Design Workshop,
a wargaming
mit
design
der
workshop,
Thematik oder zur Thematik hybride
which
Kriegführung.
dealt with hybrid
Also alles
warfare.
Dinge, die
So these are the
weiteren
kinds of things
den Forschungen dienen,
that
dem Wissenserwerb
are part
dienen,
of
dem
general
Kenntniserwerb
research
dienen und
activities
über die
are meant
Streitgrenzen
to
hinausgehen,
increase our knowledge and
eine
expertise,
Rolle
and
spielen.
which play a
Ich
role
komme zum
beyond
zweiten,
the
zur
limited sphere of
Zielsetzung
the armed forces. Let me
der
now
Wiener
pass on to the second
Strategiekonferenz generell.
part, the objectives in general of
Wir
the Vienna
haben
Strategy
uns zum Ziel
Conference.
gesetzt, eine vom deutschen
The objective
Sprachraum
we have
ausgehende, aber hochrangig
decided
international
is
besetzte
to organize
Strategieentwicklungsplattform.
a strategy development platform which starts
Es
from the
geht dabei,
German-speaking
ich wiederhole
area,
mich hier,
but includes an
nicht
international field
in
of
den vorangegangenen
experts. And
Jahren auch
let me
nicht
repeat what I said in
vorrangig
previous years. This is
militärisches
not
Verständnis von Strategie,
mainly about
sondern
military understanding of
es
strategy.
geht
Rather,
ein
we're talking
politikübergreifendes,
about a
ein gesamtstrategisches Denken. Und
strategic
ganz egal, aus welchen
overall
Ländern wir auch kommen, wir sehen, dass wir,
overall
dass die
strategic
Länder immer
thinking
wieder gefordert
across
sind, gerade in diesen
dimensional
Bereichen
approach, and It has been
etwas
shown
nachzuholen und
again and again that
vielleicht ein bisschen
actually in the
tiefer
military
und
sphere there's
weiter in die
something we have to
Zukunft
catch
zu
up on,
blicken
and
und
it's
diese
necessary also to
Dimension
take a look at the
weit,
future
bedeutender zu nehmen.
and extend the dimension of our
Die
activities.
Konferenzreihe
The
dient
series of
der
conferences
langfristigen Entwicklung
is therefore
eines
meant
Lehrgegenstandes
to develop in the long term
strategisches Denken.
the discipline of
Und
strategic
diese
thinking,
Konferenzreihe folgt daher einem vorausbeurteilten thematischen
and therefore the
Im ersten Jahr und
the
diejenigen, die jedes Jahr hier teilgenommen haben, erinnern sich
organization of
vielleicht noch,
topics has been
dass es im
predefined. Who
ersten
was
Jahr
here for the
darum
first
gegangen ist,
conference may remember
zunächst eine
actually that
Arbeitsdefinition
first of
zu
all
finden.
we tried to find a working
Eine
definition
Arbeitsdefinition des Strategiebegriffes.
of the concept of strategy.
Im Jahr 2,
In the second year of our
folgenden
conference,
Jahr, wurde der Frage nachgegangen,
we then studied
ob strategisches
the question
Denken lehrbar ist.
whether it is possible
Wie ein
to
solcher
teach strategic thinking.
Lehrgegenstand auch
We tried
strukturiert
to
sein
find out
müsste
how to
und
structure
wie ein
such a
solcher Lehrgegenstand
subject
letztlich sich in
when
ein
teaching it, and
Gesamtkonzept der
how it could be
Militärwissenschaft sich einfügen sollte.
integrated in an overall
Im
concept of military
Jahr
sciences. In the
wurde
third
dann
year of
die
our
gefundene
conference,
Arbeitsdefinition und
the
die
working definition which we had
erarbeitete
agreed
Struktur
on and the structure
auf
we
ein
had
erstes
developed
praktisches
were applied
Thema
to a first
angewandt,
practical
mit dem die
subject
Begriffsquadriga Narrative,
with the four
Cyber
narratives: cyber,
Hybridität
hybridity,
und Resilienz
and resilience.
durchleuchtet werden
These were
sollten.
the four concepts
Ich komme
we
zum
tried
Punkt
to
3
study. Now let me
zur
move on to the third part of
Zielsetzung
my
für die
speech,
heurige
the objectives
Strategiekonferenz.
of this year's strategy
Die
conference.
heurige Konferenz widmet sich
This year's
dem
conference
wesentlichsten treibenden Faktor von Strategie.
will be dealing with the
widmet
main
sich dem
driving
Willen.
factor of strategy,
Und
with the
ausgegangen
concept
wird
of
dabei
will,
vom Clausewitzschen
starting
Bild
of
des
course
Krieges
from
als
Clausewitz's
Zweikampf,
image
in dem
of
zwei entgegengesetzte
war as a clash
unabhängige Willensmomente
of two
aufeinander prallen.
opposite and independent
Geschätzte Damen und
wills.
Herren,
Ladies and
das ist
gentlemen,
ganz wesentlicher Teil
there's one
jeglicher
fundamental part of
wissenschaftlicher
every
Arbeit,
scientific activity,
das
which
ist
is
eben die Dokumentation, die
documentation,
Nachvollziehbarkeit. Und
being able
so
to
setzt sich auch diese Reihe,
document
diese Strategiekonferenz
things.
auch immer
And
zum
that's
Ziel,
one of the objectives of
das
our
Wissen,
series of conferences as well. We
die
always try
Information,
to collect
die
the
Debatten,
knowledge,
die
the
Diskussionen,
information
die hier auch stattfinden,
gained
auch
in
niederzuschreiben,
the
und zu
discussions, the lectures. We
Und,
try to
so
record
ist
them and
jeweils im
publish them.
Nachgang zur Konferenz
And so following the
ein
conference every year,
Konferenzband, der herausgegeben wird.
we have
Dieser
published
fasst eben die Vorträge und
the
die
outcomes of the
Diskussionsergebnisse
conference,
zusammen.
which summarizes
ist
the lectures
das
and the
sichtbare
information
Ergebnis
collected in the conference. It's the
unseres
visible result
aller
of our
Strategieentwicklungsprozess.
strategy
Und der Band
development
aus dem
process.
Vorjahr 2015
Last year's volume
liegt auch bereits auf und ist auch
has
zu
actually
entnehmen.
been
Und Sie
published
haben ihn
already,
wahrscheinlich bereits entnommen
if
beim,
probably
bei der Konferenzregistration.
received it at the point of registration for the conference.
Geschätzte Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen,
wir haben bereits einen ersten Schritt
the first step
gesetzt zur
has already
Verwendung
been done as regards
dieser Ergebnisse und dieses
the
Konferenz
use of the
Bandes,
outcomes
dieser
of our
Konferenzbände,
conference
in der Lehre und haben ihn bereits
in
beim
teaching.
Generalstabslehrgang in
We've
der Lehre
actually used it
eingesetzt.
in the
Und haben
General
daher
Staff
ein
Course,
vorläufiges Lehrbuch für strategisches
so
Denken
a
letztendlich
preliminary
damit geschaffen.
textbook
Geschätzte Damen
for
und Herren,
strategic
ich
thinking has
erkläre
been
die Konferenz
prepared.
2019
Ladies and gentlemen, with this lecture me open the 2019 Strategy Conference. I wish you a very fruitful conference with highly interesting presentations and inspiring discussions. Only the lectures and the panel contributions by high-level experts from more than 15 nations, and with the contribution you will give in the discussions, will allow us to also continue the objectives of the Vienna conference series into the future. With your help, with your commitment, ladies and gentlemen, be it as a speaker, be it as a moderator or participant of the panel discussions, or be it as a participant in the conference. With your help, I'm sure we will manage to achieve this objective. Welcome again, and let me wish you a successful conference. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again in Vienna to the fourth week of strategy. It is a cooperation together with Brigadier General Dr. Wolfgang PEISCHEL, who is not only a very nice colleague, but meanwhile a very good friend. And for many, many years we have shared a lot of common ideas. And one idea was, when Wolfgang PEISCHEL started with his strategic week here, he invited me to create a part which will be much more scientifically oriented in the sense that we use results of different scientific disciplines to give basics to strategic thinking. This means the plan was to have an interdisciplinary symposium, including psychologists, political scientists, sociologists, and so on. And meanwhile, we have become a family, and most of the speakers are here the first time, some are new, and I'm very happy that you have followed our invitation and to participate in this special part of scientific perspectives of strategic thinking. The undertitle, of course, has some affinity to the main title, about strategy and will, which is very problematic because you all know that in philosophy there are hundreds of discussions. What is will? How can you grasp will? Thus, my title was Motivation, Intentional and Strategic Decision Making, to look for some cognitive sciences basics to this topic. Also, there are some common elements, so there is an overlap between the two parts. The focuses are very different. On the one hand, the focus is on basic thinking processes, and the other focus of the part of Brigadier PEISCHEL is on strategy, strategic thinking and strategy. It's not the same, but of course there is a very close interrelatedness. Yeah, that's all what I have to say to you. After Brigadier PEISCHEL will have given his welcome greetings, we will split off here. Those who are interested in the part of the aspects of scientific strategic thinking will follow me to the HBF, to the cinema, what they have here, and the other half will remain here, and later on we will fit together. So again, welcome in Vienna. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a nice week, also a cultural one, because Vienna has offered very lot, but you know me well. Thank you.
Hochgeehrte Generalität, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren,
Generals, ladies and gentlemen,
es ist mir eine Freude und Ehre
it is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you for the fourth Vienna Strategy Conference, which is organized together by the Austrian Military Journal, the Center for People-Oriented Leadership and Military Policy, and the European Military Press Association. The purpose of the conference has already been outlined by my commandant, and I would like to point out once again that, as in previous years, we are quite consciously trying to go beyond the simply military understanding of strategy and to focus on an interdisciplinary, holistic thinking. With this conference series, we want to develop a subject or a course on strategic thinking. We try to shed some light on research questions, discussions of potential hypotheses, conclusions of previous presentations. All of this was done as a result of a two-day closed meeting that we organize prior to the conference. In order to show that we're really developing strategy and not simply leaving the lectures as they were given, we have also discussed the question with the panelists to what extent the hypotheses were followed up on and how do we have to develop our further understanding. And I would like to share with you some ideas about the conclusions of the last conference that you will also find as a printout in your handouts. And since some comrades have told me quite critically that this is almost impossible to do because of the many different and very intense presentations that were given, so I would like to make the attempt anyway. So I will go through the individual core theses that we came up with during the last conference, and we'll tell you what the result had been, in a very condensed version, of course. The first thesis is it's not about the concept of quadriga itself, but about the concept standing behind the quadriga. So the concepts of the quadriga cannot really be fully defined, but actually we should only focus on the wrong perception of these four concepts. They are used in order to mask an existing strategic deficit or defective efforts to defend oneself. So this was supported by a majority. Of course, we need to continue to scientifically develop these four concepts. This narrative concept, could this be carried by a manipulative intention? That was the second hypothesis. So we found large agreement that none of these partial areas constitute a basically new phenomenon, and that the cyber asymmetry-headed resilience is not a solution-oriented value-added, but could be carried by a suggestive and manipulative intention. The next hypothesis that this narrative could be just the expression of a restricted ability to engage in strategic thinking. So the phenomenon could be construed that this narrative is used in order to mask the lack of readiness to defend the country. And this was largely approved because the use of this narrative does not necessarily have to come from a targeted intention. This could also be the consequence of a general European strategic deficit. And the offset strategy and asymmetry, two sides of the same coin, thinking back to conventional ability of defense as a solution. The traditional offset strategy and asymmetry constitute two sides of one coin. But basically we should differentiate whether they come from the technical superiority or inferiority. This might take us back to a robust conventional ability to defend the country, but this only found moderate support. So there's a strong faith of the political elites in the Western technological superiority. This would allow us to compensate things, to be able to face our opponents at eye level. But it was identified that this cyber capacities mean that we're probably not going to be superior to China in terms of force multipliers. Now, the founding myths, the narratives such as founding myths, language, culture, religion, ethnic origin or ideology, which serve as a focal point of identity, have to be used as a basis for a strategic assessment. A large number of conflicts would have shown us very painfully that we need to make clear delimitations as a basis for stable peace. Is the West succumbing to the effect of the opponent's narrative? So these narratives are the glue that keeps the political and social systems together. But at the same time, this also constitutes an instrument that political elites could use in order to show a distorted image of reality and to weaken the coherence of the opponent or to reduce their ability to defend themselves. Any approaches that are targeted at steering the people in a certain direction, even if this were to serve a higher humanitarian purpose, will fail if this is unmasked by oppositional forces and can lead to a dangerous polarization and a profound destabilization of the entire political system of a country. We need to recognize that Western societies are developing a certain understanding for these offensives directed against them. And they come up with a seemingly credible narrative, and this naivete is stronger the more this narrative is fading as a consequence of postmodern developments, and the own state cannot really come up with value-based convictions that need to be strengthened, as can be seen in the Silk Road project. So the opinion was held widely that responsive and responsible strategic thinking is required. So we need to come up with a narrative such as Trojan horses that immunize our societies. So is it a great narratives or the addressees that lose the force of immunity? According to Lyotard, these major narratives have begun to lose their impact. A possible explanation for that could be seen in the fact that this excessive individualism and need for centralization has led to a general disinterest among the citizens for these political objectives and intellectual tendencies. So would this create a citizen that is more mature and cannot be influenced by such narratives? Then this would be helpful for a democratic maturity of our society. But these major narratives are increasingly rejected, and even though these narratives are easy to see through, the conclusion that this World Values Survey on individualism and secularization would lead to developments that would make us more susceptible even for narratives that are quite see-through and transparent. But this was generally approved. So it is not the great narratives that are losing their effect in postmodernity, but the addressees who are less immune to manipulative narratives. So criticism of a state interpretation of the World Values Survey of Engelhard Wenzel. Professor Gunnar Heinzson, who followed the conference online, and he will also be speaking here, has made a valuable criticism of the statements of Engelhard Wenzel and a static interpretation of the results. The statement that the European states in the upper right quadrant are basically unwilling to engage in a conflict or war, this can only be seen with a grain of salt, because over a long period of time they were ready to accept very high losses in order to pursue their strategic objectives. But the world value certainly leads to this assumption. And Professor Hansen has completely rightly pointed out that I had not sufficiently pointed out that the eras of enlightenment was added after the fact. This arrow, which shows the development of an excessive enlightenment, which almost endangers democracy. And we tried to move into a dynamic way of showing things, that Europe is not basically incapable of engaging in strategic thinking, but that this is due to the postmodern change of values. And this is why the reduction of births in Europe is not the consequence of intellectual history, but the consequence of sexual development. If we went from a decline of Europe into a postmodern state that endangers democracy, which is driven by certain developments, then the sinking numbers of births can be interpreted as a consequence of this change of values. So we need to have a controlling influence on this change of values. This helps to strengthen the ability to engage in strategic thinking at the level of European states. And Professor Hansen talked about the demographic dimension and the World Values Survey. So will narratives gain in importance as opposed to Lyotard? Basically, there was the assessment that these major narratives are gaining in power and importance. As an example, for the use of narratives that would strengthen the strategic actors that are legitimated to the inside as well as to the outside, the Russian approach used on the Crimean Peninsula against Ukraine, fundamentalist Islam, the Silk Road project, and the two scenarios where states could fall apart. Then the right to self-determination based on ethnic identity and founding myths was discussed. As examples for the second category of narratives that are gaining in power, those where the truth is distorted towards one's own people, so that not even this strategic deficit or inability to engage in defensive efforts. We discussed a topic that these asymmetric or hybrid approaches would only require cyber capabilities, and robust conventional military capabilities would no longer be so important, that it would be enough to secure the resilience in a dynamic way. It was recognized that such erroneous assessments had to be discussed, and these were constituted examples for the second category of narratives, if there were an intention behind them. But most conference participants doubted whether there was an intention behind it. This lack of strategy was rather unintentional, and the need for a stronger engagement of Europe for more security and defense was basically recognized. So we should have a dynamic securing of the resilience of our population. So Clausewitz put this in, well, strategic defensive only in case of operative ability to engage in offensive conflict. So the demand was also supported that strategy can only be understood dynamically and used dynamically, according to Matleri and Schuftan. The opinion was held that the significance of armed forces should not be doubted, but that their traditional conventional orientation would take a less prominent role and will be replaced by more defensive and offensive cyber measures. The demand was put forward that narratives should not lead to a situation where the political leadership and the population should buy the opponent's propaganda rhetoric or should fail to see the faulty narratives. Also, the motive of trying to avoid excessive fears in the population would not be a valid argument. By focusing too much on hybridity, we cannot justify that the conventional defense capabilities should be neglected. So we need to take into account more threats, military as well as non-military threats. And there's also an increasing complexity of leadership requirements. We need to be able to take defensive measures in an adequate way. So we should not excessively focus on the hybridity of threats as an argument in order to downplay the importance of conventional defensive forces. But of course, sometimes we questioned whether the traditional based armed forces were still so important in light of high-tech and cyber capabilities. So we need to make sure that we don't draw the false conclusions. So the question as to whether the European political elites maybe used this narrative in order to strengthen the subjective feeling of security, but the opinion prevailed that the use of such a narrative was not intentional, but where it occurs, it can be interpreted as a lack of far-reaching strategic assessment. The little green men are as threatening as the conventional potential standing behind them. That's a compound warfare theory. So these little green men that the Russians used in the offensive against Ukraine was the main point in the current discussion about the importance of hybridity for European security. This formal inability to be attacked of Russia, as he mentioned, and the consequence is that this hybrid attack of Russia maybe led to the discussion whether maybe it was Europe's fault that we didn't build up a strong balance of power with respect to Russia. And then we could have engaged in negotiations. But the discussion showed in the following that the principles of the calm warfare theory and the actual scope of the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, including the recursive approach and the objective to develop the armed forces on the basis of a completely new military science, required a further discussion of this topic in the following strategic conferences in order to examine this theory. Then the new paradigm of assessment that in light of a vacuum of capabilities, we have to focus on the potential, and that can actually lead to force that changes reality. So only the hypothetical potential ability of an offensive use of force, even if there is no intention behind it, and if on the other side, no matter whether due to a lack of interoperability or a lack of ability to defend oneself, there's a conventional power vacuum, but it was found that there needs to be a deeper research and discussion process before validation can happen. Such a vacuum could not only happen in the Baltic states, but also in southeastern Europe. The assessment was welcomed that Russia, with its potential and its strategic approaches, had actually begun to change the reality of European defense capabilities. There's an increasing defense budget on the northeastern flank of NATO, and the coherence between the European NATO states was burdened, and this could also constitute a political goal, according to Militär Kruger. The contribution of the armed forces to fight risks from the cyberspace, so an interdisciplinary moderation of the ultimate ratio of cyber defense. So we need to control cyberspace, or at least be able to defend ourselves against the risks arising in cyberspace. And we need a good cooperation between all the different departments. So the military plays a substantial role because we could moderate these threats. The conclusion that the cyber dimension needs to be developed together with the maritime aspects and the strategic use of space, and to assess it from the perspective of global commons. Now I'd like to summarize these final theses that the buildup of conventional forces could mean that we can meet our opponent at eye level, and we would be able to answer tit for tat, and that we could avoid an escalation if Europe could identify in due time that the security policy effectiveness of its liberal, postmodern, soft narrative has become exhausted. So this was taken up as a basic idea and will become the basis of further discussion. But it was recognized that by choosing that approach, we would, according to Matlarin, Erentix, Schiften, and Birk, have a potential that has no offensive intentionality behind it, and that also needs to support this cyber defense capabilities. And of course, this needs to be studied in the following as to whether this is valid. So this, in a nutshell, has been the summary of what we discussed during the last conference. Now, this year's general topic of the strategy conference is, as we already heard, is strategy and will. We start from Clausewitz's understanding of the war as a clash of two different wills, and the answer will be addressed to what extent will determines the intuitive level of strategic goals, whether the factor of happiness plays a role in the cultural space, whether postmodern development of Western societies has an influence on the ability to form a strategic will, and whether the formula potential times intention or will constitutes the threat. And this was the assessment. And we need to find out whether this still determines things in 2021. Now I would like to start with the content part of this conference. I'd like to wish you interesting discussions. It is only on the basis of lectures and final contributions of distinguished experts from 15 nations who will share their contributions with us. Only that will be possible to continue to develop the strategic conference as Baron von Rosen intended it. In his review on security and peace, he found that the Vienna Strategy Conference is a high-ranking strategy development and discussion platform that helps to rethink strategy. And for view of the future, he asked whether the Vienna Strategy Conference can set the tone for similar approaches in German-speaking countries, or could even take a guiding role. It is with your help that I'm hoping for, that it will depend on, can we proceed in this direction of achieving this goal. I would like to wish you a very interesting conference and stimulating discussions, and we'll have a short break, and We'll continue at 1:40, where we will continue with rethinking strategy, and the other conference that will be dealing with culture-specific dialogue, the cultural scientific dialogue, which will be cinema room, the Kinosaal. So after the presentations, we will meet again at 7:10 here in the Sala Terrena. The commandant will address the meeting, and I hope that this will break the ice now. Thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy the break.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, those of you who will come to the scientific thinking of strategic decision making will wait outside in 10 minutes, and I will go with you together to the cinema. Thank you.